Good morning. We had a nice little snow last night here in Portland. It doesn't snow all that much here. I was surprised to find out because it's on the coast, I suppose, but just enough to be beautiful. Today I'm going to try to bore the remaining people that persistently keep watching this video blog. I noticed there was 7 on the last one. And for all of you, I'm going to try to bore you to death with the topic of bores. It was one of Matthew's favorite topics. But before I do, a couple little pieces of housekeeping. Today I'm going to submit to Real Paranormal Magazine the final draft of my article about Charles Dickens and A Christmas Carol and its actual real authorship by Mathew Franklin Whittier and his wife Abby Poyen Whittier. I've been waiting for images of Charles Dickens' handwritten draft, which is held by the Morgan Library and Museum in New York. I'm asking permission to use some close-up images of that manuscript. What I'm quite certain of is that Dickens took Mathew and Abby's original, copied it over, threw theirs in the fire, and then ran through maybe 2 or 3 drafts of his own, of which the Morgan Library probably has number 2 or number 3. I haven't heard back, even though I wrote a specific letter to the contact person several days ago, and my deadline is the 14th of this month, February. So what I've done is I've sent in a version with the images and without the images. That's what I'm going to send the editor today, the final. And, if I get permission at the last minute, fine. He's willing to pay for them. If not, then we'll print the one that doesn't have it. Now, what I'll do when I repost it in Academia EDU, I haven't decided. I may go ahead and post the one with the images on the basis of fair use, because there is a clause that says that you should be able to publish things without permission if you use just a section of them and if it's for educational purposes. And this use definitely fits in that law. But we'll see. If I get a cease and desist, then I take them out. That's the nice thing about digital, So, there's no rational reason why I should not be able to use those images just because they hold the originals. As I've said regarding Mathew's newspaper, the Salisbury Monitor, people can own physical objects, but they can't own history. And they have no business charging for history. Universities have no business charging for history either, in my opinion. But anyway, that's just a philosophical point. The second thing I wanted to mention is I got to be sure, because I'm dyslexic, I've got to get the right arm here. You may have noticed this photograph or image in the background, and there's another one when I shoot down the hall. That's my guru, Meher Baba. I don't push him on anybody, but I kind of symbolically keep him in the background whenever I can, because that's what he is. He's always in the background of anything that I present. So symbolically, I put him up here in the background. I'll put a close-up of that image, probably. So now we're going to move on to bores. Mathew had a particular beef with bores from very early on, but especially after he lost his first family, Abby and both of their children. He lost all of them, and he was never the same since then. I think I think Mathew was rather cocky when he was young, and I have a miniature portrait which logically it seems impossible that it could be him. I feel that it's him. So either it's somebody that very much reminds me of the way Mathew was when he was young, or it really is him. There is a logical, possible connection of steps that would make it him. It's implausible, but it's possible. I'm going to put it up on the screen here. This is a miniature that came from Montevideo, South America, and this would be Mathew at about the time he wrote for the New York Constellation in about 1831. He had apparently run away to sea when he was a boy. Ships did come into New York. Somebody that he knew from his travels could have visited him in New York. If so, they would have gone out on the town and they would have had their portraits done, like getting your photograph made. And this fellow, they would have swapped portraits so that this fellow would have had Mathew's portrait. He might have ended up in South America And that portrait could somehow have ended up there. And then I bought it on eBay. That wouldn't be the first time that some obscure thing from another country ended up in my possession, as I showed you early on with the two little chamois, little tiny carvings. So karma is pretty powerful. And Abby can put things into my orbit as well from the astral world. So who knows? Anyway, if you look at that portrait, you'll see what I'm talking about. Mathew was cocky and he was smart, and he had the world was his oyster in a sense. He had his plan, for his future set out, and he was going to make his mark on the world. And then the world crushed him, as it does when you have that attitude, I think. But nonetheless, he did actually, if I'm successful in what I'm doing, he will have accomplished what he set out to do in the end, once he got a little humility. Humility is very dangerous to claim, by the way. I think some of that cockiness has been beaten out of me, but I many times wish I had that self-confidence. So here's the ideal. You should have the self-confidence without the egotism, if you can do it. It's not easy, and I'm striving for that. I have more of the humility now, I hope, knock on wood, but I don't have the self-confidence that he had most of the time. You may take exception to that, seeing that I'm claiming to be the past life author of these literary classics, but it's true. All right, so we're going to start with, of all things, a kind of a eulogy of John Greenleaf Whittier, Mathew's older brother, who died on September 7, 1892. This is all the way in England, the Yorkshire, I don't know how you pronounce that, Yorkshire Evening Post of September 26, 1892. And it's a little anecdote, and a lot of it is wrong. They've got a lot of things wrong in here, which is humorous to me, how, you tell a story around a circle, and by the time it gets to the end, it's like totally different. Women's pertinacity. The latest dead among the American poets had a brother Mathew who wrote verses. So they have retained the fact that Mathew wrote poetry. Most of them didn't. And they didn't mention Ethan Spike, so this is interesting. Mathew Whittier was asked if he was any relation of John. Quote, "The only relationship existing between John Greenleaf Whittier and myself," said he, "is we each had the same father and the same mother." Now that quote comes from a reporter named Charles O. Stickney, who kind of tricked him into thinking he was a fan and visited him at the Boston Custom House when actually he was a reporter. I think he misquoted him to make it sound harsher than it really was. But anyway, we'll let it stand. He had a sense of fun, too. He detested bores, but he could not be uncivil to them. His plan was to lead them out and lose them in the streets. Sometimes, his sister says, he would go home and say, "Well, sister, I had a hard work to lose him, but I have lost him. But I can never lose a her," he added. "The women are more pertinacious than men. Don't thee find them so, Maria?" So they have him speaking in Quaker talk, which generally he didn't do, except maybe to his family. But his sister's name was Elizabeth, not Maria. And this would never have happened in their hometown, even if he was visiting. Well, they had moved to Amesbury near Haverhill, their hometown in Massachusetts. But it would never have happened in Amesbury. It was too small. You couldn't lose anybody in the streets of Amesbury, I don't think. It could have possibly happened once in Boston. So Mathew loved these personal anecdotes, and he would tell people, and they would go 2 or 3, 4, 5 generations down the line and end up being distorted. But what we do have is that Mathew disliked bores. Okay? That's autobiographical information. Now, he wrote on this topic several times over the course of his career. But here's the thing. After Mathew lost Abby, when you're in grief, he was in perpetual grief. When you're in grief, you can barely stand people gabbing on and on. It's torture. So I think that dislike of bores got much more intense, when he got older after he had lost Abby. But here we're considerably before. This is the New England Galaxy. This is November 16, 1827, which makes Mathew 15 years old. He'd run away from home a couple years earlier, I think for the last time, like the year before. And I can probably read all of this. He's signing P. P or PP was one of Mathew's signatures. And the reason I figured out, it took a while to figure this out, but His nickname as a boy was Peter Pumpkin, and that's because he loved pumpkins, and particularly pumpkin pie, and also because a saying back then was some pumpkins. If a boy was like a pistol, which Mathew was, he had that kind of personality, tremendous energy and mischievous and so on, they'd say he was some pumpkins. So between the fact that he loved pumpkin pie and the fact that he loved pumpkins, he was given this nickname, Peter Pumpkin, and he would sign PP or sometimes just P. So here he is in the New England Galaxy. Thoughts on bores. Mr. Editor, perhaps I am a living illustration of my subject, yet what is a bore is a mere matter of opinion or of feeling, and men higher in dignity and station than myself may perhaps fall under some division of the subject. I accept, EXCEPT, I accept all editors but one, and he, sir, is not of the Galaxy. Now, I've mentioned that this is Joseph T. Buckingham that he's writing to, and I think that he became good friends with Joseph Buckingham, that Buckingham stepped in after he ran away from home and became a surrogate father, a mentor to him. There is the traveled bore, he who has lived in Europe and returns to hold a two-pronged fork in his right hand and to eat peas therewith, to annoy the citizens with strange words that may have a meaning or application, and to be the wonder of his own family, the delight of the ladies, and the admiration of himself. He can see nothing that reminds him not of France or Italy. Milton Hill is the Bay of Naples. It only wants a bay, a city, an island, and a volcano. The Mill Dam leads to comparisons with the Pontonoo Marshes, only it has no marshes. And the front of the Tremont is miserable because he has seen the opera of San Carlo. A blank plague upon him if he despised New England beauty. Why stayed he not in Venice? Or why returned he from Paris, where his highest acquaintance was with the nobility of the Palais Royal? The next is the bore professional. He cannot sink the shop, as the phrase is. Words with him are indeed, he cannot sink the shop, meaning get away from the shop, as the phrase is. Words with him are indeed things, for he has nothing of the profession but the vocabulary. Lawyers at a supper in term time rank as the highest of this class. One cannot ask another to taste wine without a learned phrase, and the whole confused concentration is a mystery impenetrable to a person not familiar with the beautiful system and classic language of the law. Then he goes on about an example. So that's Mathew at age 15 talking about bores, okay? But now we're going to move forward. I presented the carpet bag to you all yesterday in my last two entries, I believe it was. So we're moving to the carpet bag, May 8th, 1852. I don't have a physical of this one because I don't have the 1852 volume. This is Dr. Digg. This is his caricature of academia and academic philosophers. And here he's taking the part of a physician. And the title of this is Treatment of Bore, Acute and Chronic. Bore is a disease of the nerves. It attacks primarily the optic and auricular nerves. Sometimes, if tobacco is exhibited, it extends to the olfactories, producing great irritation. There is much difficulty in producing permanent cure of this disease. Most physicians content themselves with simple palliatives, which do not by any means tend to remove the cause. Bore, however, is susceptible in acute cases of perfect cure. In chronic cases, I have met with some success by adopting the homeopathic treatment, which I would certainly recommend to the faculty as the only certain method of arresting the ravages of chronic bore. And then he goes on with some cases. If you're bored, you can click out of this anytime you want. Case 1. A.B., a middle-aged gentleman, called at my office recently and holding out his right pulse and exhibiting some tongue-in-cheek, reminded me that in the dim past we had the pleasure of being flogged by the same schoolmaster. This I knew was false, as in my early years I was noted for close attention to my books. I at once suspected that A.B. was afflicted with acute bore and waited for a further development of symptoms. Presently, he was a tall man. He remarked that he was short, meaning of money, and requested a loan of $12, or, he said, 15 will do. Remember, this is 1852, so that's a fair amount of money. My diagnosis was made up. I advised the unfortunate man to shun the society of his friends and take protracted exercise in some lucrative employment. He took the prescription full strength and was discharged, cured. Case 2. While I was reading Bleak House, Dickens' book, and had become interested in the treatment of jaundice, C.D. entered my office. I noticed that his gait was slow and irresolute. I suspected that he had come to consult me on a case of acute bore. I laid down my book and proceeded to examine the patient. His pupils seemed deficient of healthy expression. He took a seat near my table, took up the book which I had laid down, and began to read. He took up his own book. I was satisfied now of the nature of his affliction, and while ruminating on a method of cure, I unconsciously took up his hat and commenced piercing holes through it with a lancet. He dropped my book, asked for his hat, and through the influence of simple suggestion said, "I must be going." As he has not called on me since, I have no doubt he was cured by the use of the lancet, as mentioned above. Case 3. Chronic bore. E.F., an adipose individual who had once been out west and had contracted a vicious habit of repeating to me at every visit the causes, progress, and results of his tour, with very slight variations. I'm sorry, sometimes you get started on a sentence you've never read before and you don't know which way to go with it. Case 3, chronic bore. E.F., an adipose individual who had once been out west and had contracted a vicious habit of repeating to me at every visit the causes, progress, and results of his tour with very slight variations. Had been afflicted 2 years, had had several prescriptions from eminent physicians, but had found no relief. I determined, after mature deliberation, to exhibit a non-metallic electropositive element. Chronic cases must be encountered by chronic remedies. I prepared a large bolus or pill composed entirely of boron. On his first call thereafter, he began, "While I was in Cairo, sir," said I, "listen to me." My imposing manner and professional bearing arrested, as I suppose, his attention. He seemed to forget his sufferings for the moment. Now, thought I, is the favorable occasion to produce a counter-irritation. I placed my finger on his lips to prevent the escape of the nauseating pill, and then told him the story of Johnson and Boswell, and the roast mutton, and the red buff cap in which the pudding was boiled. The dose did not seem to produce much effect, but I determined to keep him under the influence of the medicine. On the very next day, he again presented himself, and was proceeding to detail his case as was his custom. I requested him to wait one moment, only one, as I had a capital story to tell him. I produced the bolus as before, repeating the exact words meanwhile as on the previous day. I noticed slight symptoms of nausea. On the third day, I again exhibited boron in the same form. He was powerfully wrought upon the drug. "Doctor," said he, "isn't that too much of a dose for every day?" "No," said I, "you can go home and laugh over it, and it will do you good." To my great joy, he left without mentioning Cairo. On 2 subsequent occasions, having dined too heartily, his old complaints began to return, but I exhibited the boron as at first. A year has passed since his first relapse, and I consider him radically cured. And there's another case. We'll move on. Now we're going to move into a nice piece of evidence, and there's lots of intersecting elements to this. I'm going to show you what a complex interwoven tapestry this study has been to me. So I shared with you a little of Yankee Doodle, 1846-1847 humor magazine in New York City. It was the first patterned after Britain's Punch in America. Mathew was quite well represented in it. And I showed you that, among other things, there are parodies of Edgar Allan Poe, and in particular, a parody of The Raven. And I read a little bit to you, the first stanza. Well, it so happens that when we get into the second stanza, the subject of bores comes up, and it's very relevant, which you'll see when we get to his second parody of The Raven in the Carpetbag. So here we have The Bedbug and No Other Poems by E.A. Poe, P-O-H. And he says the original is much longer, but these stanzas are respectfully submitted as specimens, which again, as I said before, means there's a lot more I'd like to say, but this is all I can say in print. And he begins the first two stanzas. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, lolling weary over several curious books of sure-to-be-forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly sleeping, suddenly there came a creeping, as of some grimalkin peeping at an open pantry door. So, I said, 'tis some mosquito, or some fly was here before, only this, and nothing more. But full soon there came a burning that brought on an uneasy turning, and again I felt the creeping somewhat stronger than before. Then I cried, there's in the blanket something worse, and I don't thank it, for coming thus to prank it, and my quiet couch explore, for coming thus at midnight hour my calm couch to explore, 'tis a most confounded bore. And it goes on about the bedbug. Okay, so that's 1846. Now, in the Weekly Museum, the Boston Weekly Museum, the December 7, 1850 edition, pardon me, I have to make a little room for a couple things. Here we have my pillow that I, from the dollar store, that I use to cushion the volumes. We do things on the cheap around here. And here is the 1850 volume of the Weekly Museum. And we're going to move to the December 7, 1850 edition. This is Quails, whom the scholars mistakenly think was Ashen Dodge, because Ashen Dodge and the editor colluded to tell the readership that Dodge was writing this travelogue when it was always Mathew Franklin Whittier. This is a very interesting and complex subject because Mathew used this seemingly innocuous travelogue to report his contacts as a liaison for the abolitionist movement in the Underground Railroad. He met people like Daniel Webster and Victor Hugo in Paris, and the president and several governors. This was not the entertainer Ashen Dodge meeting all these people. Entertainer Ashen Dodge wouldn't have had a chance of being invited to Victor Hugo's home, nor Daniel Webster's for that matter. He was acting, I believe, as a liaison for William Lloyd Garrison, reporting back. And rather than report back through the mails, which could have been opened, by the Southern pro-slavery spies, he did it in the open in this travelogue. Well, this particular one cross-references Mathew with his character Ethan Spike. Now, in 1850, nobody knew that Ethan Spike was Mathew Franklin Whittier. That was only revealed in 1857. The scholars now say that Mathew wrote Ethan Spike. So we can use that as an anchor. Here, Quails, who is kind of a fictional character in himself, he's portrayed as an old man who's working for the government. Quails visits Edwin Plummer, an editor of the Portland Eclectic, and together they go on a little walk to visit Ethan Spike. And there's a mention of where Ethan Spike lived. Ethan Spike supposedly lived on the corner of Pearl Street and Congress. Well, I also knew that Mathew's flat in Portland had been burned down. No, I'm sorry, they don't mention that in the article, but the route that they give leads right there, okay? And the article that talks about Mathew's flat being burned down says that it was at Congress and Pearl Street. Well, I'm going to put up an image from Google Street Map of Congress and Pearl Street. This is where the grocery store, Sawyer's Grocery, was, that was burned down, and Mathew's flat was on the top floor. I think they burned him out. I think it was arson. I don't know for sure it was on the corner that's in the background. It's a parking lot, but I feel that it was. There's also on the opposite corner, there's a park that was built after the Civil War, I believe, and so on. I tried looking it up. I went to Brown Library, connected with the Longfellow House here in Portland. They, even with the assistance of staff, nobody could find where the Sawyer Grocery was on that corner. So I traced it as far as I could. Now I'm boring everybody, including myself. So we're going to pick this up where Quails has come to visit Edwin Plummer, the editor of The Eclectic. And it's fairly long, but it's kind of important. So I'm going to go ahead and read all of it as quickly and efficiently as I can, because this is going to lead to something else. Basically, Mathew has written a story of being accosted by probably a fan of Ethan Spike who's found him out. But at any rate, a bore. And this guy has come into his apartment and won't leave, and Mathew's really trying to get rid of him. But the reason I'm going into this is because for the Carpetbag, Mathew writes a parody of The Raven called The Vulture, which tells the same story that he has told as Quails. Okay, you see how the dots are connecting? Having been informed, he's now visiting Plummer, having been informed that most original of all geniuses, now Mathew liked to use that phrase, having been informed that most original of all geniuses, Ethan Spike, Esquire, late of Hornby, Maine, resided somewhere in the vicinity of Portland, we told friend Plummer that we should consider it a great favor if we could, by hook or crook, obtain an introduction to the gentleman, over whose 4th of July orations and chit-chat correspondence of the Boston Chronotype we had enjoyed many a hearty laugh. So I told you that Boston Chronotype was the radical newspaper, the anti-slavery newspaper. Mathew wrote as Ethan Spike and a number of other characters for that paper, anti-slavery stuff, and also against the Mexican-American War. He started that before James Russell Lowell began his Hosea Biglow series, the Biglow Papers. The Biglow Papers was a bad knockoff of Ethan Spike, written in response to Mathew's Spike in the Chronotype. Okay, and Ethan Spike is forgotten, and James Russell Lowell's bad knockoff, the Biglow Papers, is big historical news. All right, I'm sorry. So Mathew's telling us that he is, in fact, an original genius. Okay, this is tongue-in-cheek, but it isn't, like a lot of humor. So he would like to meet Ethan Spike. You would, says Plummer. Indeed we would, we replied. Can you assist us in the matter? Put on your beaver, meaning top hat. Put on your beaver, says Plummer. Button up your old Greeley coat, which is a Quaker coat. And in 5 minutes' walk, you shall be cozily seated by the side of the old gentleman himself. Now, Mathew has as much as identified himself here as Quails. Okay, it's that close to outright telling us who he is. Time being now too precious for slow movements or commonplace observations, we both hurried down Exchange Street without exchanging a single syllable of conversation. But our imagination was rapidly picturing out the age, size, shape, and appearance of the mirth-provoking Mr. Spike, Esquire. Of course, we said to ourselves, Mr. Spike is a very large man, perhaps justice of the peace, rather corpulent in form, a large bottle-shaped and flaming red proboscis, and a pair of eyes that might easily be mistaken for a couple of capsized pink teacups. Judge then of our surprise when we were introduced into the presence of a man only about 30 years of age, 5 feet 10 inches in height, rather slim in form, with a sharp cast of features and a pair of little dazzling black eyes that fairly made the corners of our mouth pucker for a hearty laugh in spite of ourselves. Mathew has described Ocean Dodge, the man who supposedly was the author of Quails. He was going along with this thing to deepen his cover, but he has actually described Ocean Dodge here. This is very interesting to me. I may be boring everybody else to tears. Who knows? Okay, so although Judge Halliburton, who wrote Sam Slick, although Judge Halliburton manufactured an undying fame by his Sam Slick letters, we would consider them, so far as a naturalness of Yankee peculiarity is concerned, not much superior to the writings of Ethan Spike, Esquire, late of Hornby, Maine. Now, as Quails, Mathew was going to visit Judge Halliburton up in Canada when he went to St. John to see his ex-wife. But he didn't do it. And his explanation was something about he learned about all the holdings that Judge Halliburton had there. But the real reason was, I think he found out that he was pro-slavery, and there was no way that he was going to go talk to him. So he admired his work, but he says that Ethan Spike wasn't too much below him in reproducing Yankee dialect. Well, the truth is Mathew was way earlier. Mathew started Joe Strickland in 1826, okay, as a 13-year-old boy. So he initiated this whole genre before Halliburton, if I'm not mistaken. Somebody may know somebody earlier, but no scholar so far has come up with anybody earlier. Now, on the morning of the 21st, we were treated with the first snowstorm of the season, and Portland really looked as if she was dressed for a bridal party with her flowing robes of virgin white and ruffles of diamond flakes, just like I showed you in the beginning of the entry. As we were busily engaged in our room, he's speaking of himself with the writing with the royal we. As we were busily engaged in our room on the morning of the 22nd instant, meaning the previous 22nd, preparatory to a continuation of our journey east as far as Bangor and perhaps to the British provinces, meaning he's going up to St. John to visit his children, there suddenly came a knock on our door that sounded so much like the official tap of a sheriff with an unpaid bill from the washerwoman that we had for the moment a serious intention of crawling under the bed and screaming at the top of our lungs that we were out entirely and couldn't be seen until the departure of the second train for Yarmouth. Before we could put our precautionary plan into execution, however, the door opened and a large head covered with a profusion of bushy black hair slowly made its appearance through the aperture, and ere we could say good morning, how do you do, walk in, or any other of the commonplace observations usually used on such occasions, the whole body slid into the room, closed the door, seated itself before the fire, crossed its legs, placed its hat on the carpet, and after squirting about half a pint of the filthiest tobacco juice on the stove, exclaimed, "How do you do? I'm happy for to make your acquaintance. I hain't never afore seen ye. I've heard on ye a good many times, but I suppose ye never heard on me. My name is Digits. I'm a kinder of a speculator in knickknacks and all that sort of thing. I never seen ye afore, but I see by the papers that a spell ago you was up in V. Now, I used to live in V myself, although it was V with a dash, although it was an all-fired spell ago, and I hain't been there never since the day I left. How do you find the folks up there?" We informed Mr. Digits that according to our best knowledge, the folks were so-so, and no doubt they would be pleased to learn that he was enjoying the same blessings. This is one of Matthew's jokes, to say that something's awful and hope you're enjoying the same blessings. I've seen it elsewhere. I have to lean over. The type is very small and this volume is huge. "Well, I know about that," replied Mr. Digits, emptying his mouth of another half pint of dark-colored liquid. "I used to have some pretty good friends up there, but that was a good many years ago, and likes anyway, they've all forgotten me by this time. But won't you have a char tobacco?" Taking from his capacious trousers pocket a piece of pigtail that looked like the end of an old tarred rope, fresh from some smoky garret or attic in an Ann Street junk shop. "No, thank ye," we replied. "We never use the weed, and unless you wish to transact some business with us, you will please excuse us for the present, as we have some writing to attend to this morning that must not be neglected." As we closed our last remark, we seated ourselves at the table, took up our old steel pen, and commenced a vigorous display of our chirographic powers. Not to be so easily cut, however, Mr. Digits recrossed his leg, threw back the collar of his coat, and exclaimed, "Oh, Wall, if you've got any business to attend to, don't pay no attention to me. I hain't no doubt you're almost bored to death by having folks come in to see you and having long stories to tell that ain't no interest to you whatsomever. But I've got a little better manners than all that comes to, I hope. So, heavens and earth," we exclaimed to ourselves, "will the fellow never get through? You might go right on with your writing, and I won't be no bother to ye whatsomever. The fact of the business is, I'm as fond of my friends as anybody, but I know by my own experience that," here our head began to ache unmercifully, "folks can't allers feel the same. nor they don't allers feel as if they could afford to enjoy the surcity of new acquaintances when they has other business on their hands. Now keep in mind, this is Matthew's Ethan Spike style to write in dialect like this, but he's doing it as Quails. You know, there's no reason to believe Ocean. The whole thing with Ocean has been disproved. I won't even go into it. It's definitely Mathew, the author of Ethan Spike. Having just commenced a letter to a friend in Bangor, and our attention being equally divided between our business and the impudent fellow's never-ending clatter, we had it, quote, Portland on their hands. So you can go right on just the same as though you was all by yourself. And after you get through, if you have any time to spare and would like a chaw or tobacco, or I believe you said you didn't chaw, we'll sit down and perhaps I can give you a few good ideas on your best plan for buzz, buzz, buzz. We could hear no more. The fellow had made us so desperate that we sprang from our chair and in a tone of thunder exclaimed, Leave the room, sir. Leave the room instantly, or the consequences be upon your own head. Not another word, not a word. Don't you open your mouth, but leave the room instantly. Snatching up his hat and looking as if he had received an unexpected shock from a galvanic battery or been nearly skinned alive by a flash of lightning, Mr. Digits slid out of the room at a pace that would have put Morse's new telegraph to the blush. We regret very much losing our temper on the above occasion, and hoping that this number of the museum may happen to fall under the observation of our dear friend Digits, we will now apologize for so doing, offering at the same time a bit of advice for his consideration, viz., always knock before entering the room of a stranger. Never seat yourself until you have been invited to do so, and never under any consideration use a handsome parlor stove as a spittoon. So that is Matthew Franklin Whittier writing as Quails for the Boston Weekly Museum about visiting Ethan Spike and in the Ethan Spike style. Now, I'm not pussyfooting around when I talk about evidence. This is not the kind of evidence you're accustomed to by New Age people that say bizarre things, okay? This is actual evidence. Now, it so happens that there is a parody of The Raven called The Vulture. And if you look it up, you will find that scholars are divided on who wrote it, chiefly because they found what they thought was the first appearance of it in different publications. So one set of scholars found it in the December 1853 edition of Graham's magazine. And I will show it to you. It's at the very end of this volume in December 1853. I think, see, this I can show you without worrying about breaking the spine. I have more control over these little ones. And the entire thing is in here, as Mathew wrote it, unsigned, says The Vulture, an ornithological study after the late Edgar A. Poe. The illustrations appear to be done by a Britisher, possibly George Hine, I believe his name was. And that's one reason that other scholars decided it was not written by John Sachs. John Sachs has a piece directly, it's either before or after this. I think it's immediately after this. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, here it is. Love and Lucre, an allegory by John G. Sachs, S-A-X-E, who was an American humorist. And I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but it's right directly under The Vulture, signed by him. So for some reason, the scholars imagined that that Sachs had written this as well, although normally he would have signed both. There's no reason that he would have written one of them anonymously and signed the second one, see? So it's not really rational. But anyway, then somebody found it in George Cruikshank's The Comic Almanac in the 1853 edition. But this would have come out, see, Graham's, that's December 53. This would be the beginning of 1853. So this one would have to be first. And here it is. But there's one little fly in the ointment here, and that is that this one is missing one of the illustrations. So how could the later one have an illustration that the first one is missing? See, they decided that this was Robert B. Brough, B-R-O-U-G-H, I believe, that had written this, because the illustrations look like they're done by a British writer, British illustrator, and it appeared first, as they thought, in England. But it didn't appear first in England. It appeared first in the Carpet Bag in the December 18th, 1852 Carpet Bag. Now, I don't happen to have the second volume of the Carpet Bag. I'm going to have to put up images of it. But what I'll do is, because the one that appears in Graham's is precisely identical, it's precisely identical, but these illustrations, if you look at them very closely, have been redrawn. They're not reprinted, and that's probably the technology of 1850s, that it wasn't easy, or maybe it wasn't even possible, unless you obtained the original plates. You couldn't print the original, you couldn't photograph them and print them, so you had to redraw them. So in each of these three, the illustrations, if you look at them very closely, have all been redrawn. Now I'm going to read this entire thing, and I'm going to do it partly for posterity, because Mathew wrote this. This is basically what I just read you from Quayle's in verse. It's got to be the same exact incident. He's just written it up in verse. So again, I'm going to read the whole thing. As I do, I'll put up the illustrations, and this is kind of for posterity as well as for any of you. You can always just take the little cursor and move it over if you don't want to hear me read all of this. You know, it's very easy to bypass. I'm going to take a sip of water before I start, keeping it away from the book, of course. The Vulture, an ornithological study after the late Edgar A. Poe. The vulture is the most cruel, deadly, and voracious of birds of prey. He is remarkable for his keen scent and for the tenacity with which he invariably clings to the victim on whom he has fixed his grips. He is not to be shaken off whilst the humblest pickings remain. He is usually to be found in an indifferent state of feather, and that's from New Translation of Currier. Curvier, I think it says. Yeah, Curvier. It must be a dictionary. Okay, so here's our first illustration, and it begins. Once upon a midnight chilling, as I held my feet unwilling o'er a tub of scalding water at a heat of 94, nervously a toe in dipping, dripping, slipping, then out skipping, suddenly there came a ripping whipping at my chamber's door. "'Tis the second floor," I muttered, flipping at my chamber's door. "Once a light, and nothing more." Ah, distinctly I remember it was in the chill November, and each cuticle and member was with influenza sore. Falteringly I stirred the gruel, steaming, creaming o'er the fuel, and anon removed the jewel that each frosted nostril bore, wiped away the trembling jewel that each reddened nostril bore. Nameless here for evermore. Remember, Mathew is a humorist and a little edgy, especially for the 1850s. And I recallest a certain draught that fanned the window curtain, chilled me, filled me with the horror of 2 steps across the floor. And besides, I'd got my feet in, and a most refreshing heat in. To myself I sat repeating, if I answer to the door, rise to let the ruffian in who seems to want to burst the door, I'll be blank, that and something more. Presently, the row grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. Really, Mr. Johnson, blow it. Your forgiveness I implore, such an observation letting slip. But when a man's just getting into bed, you come upsetting nerves and posts of chamber's door, making such a row, forgetting, spoke a voice beyond the door. "'Tisn't Johnson," nothing more. Quick a perspiration clammy bathed me, but I uttered, "Dammy." Parentheses, observation wrested from me like the one I made before. Back upon the cushion sinking, hopelessly my eyes like winking on some stout for private drinking beer. ranged in rows upon the floor, fixed, and on an oyster barrel full beside them on the floor, looked and groaned, and nothing more. Now, you look this up, you'll find that it's considered one of the best parodies of the Raven. This is far and away the best parody of the Raven. Far and away. Okay? That's because it was written by the original author. Open then was flung the portal, and in stepped a hated mortal, by the moderns called a vulture, known as Sponge in days of yore. Well I knew his reputation, cause of all my agitation. Scarce a nod or salutation changed. He pounced upon the floor, coolly lifted up the oysters and some stout from off the floor, helped himself, and took some more. Then this hungry beast, untiring, fixed his gaze with fond admiring on a piece of cold boiled beef I meant to last a week or more. Quick he set to work devouring, plates in quick succession scouring, stout with every mouthful showering, made me ask to see it pour, if he quite enjoyed his supper as I watched the liquid pour. Said the vulture, nevermore. Much disgusted at the spacious vacuum by this brute voracious excavated in the beef, he'd eaten quite enough for 4. Still I felt relief surprising when at length I saw him rising, that he meant to go surmising, and I, glancing at the door, going, well, I won't detain you, mind the stairs and shut the door. Leave you, Tompkins, nevermore. Startled by an answer, dropping hints that he intended stopping all his life. I knew him equal to it if he liked, or more. Half in dismal earnest, half in joke, with an attempt at laughing, I remarked that he was chaffing, and demanded of the bore, asked what this disgusting, nasty, greedy, vile, intrusive bore meant in croaking nevermore. But the vulture, not replying, took my bunch of keys, and trying several, found at length the one to fit my private cupboard door. Took the gin out, filled the bottle, and with a sang-froid to nettle any saint, began to settle calmly down the grate before, really as he meant departing at the date I named before, of never, nevermore. Then I sat engaged in guessing what this circumstance distressing would he likely to result in, for I knew that long before, once, it served me right for drinking, I had told him that if sinking in the world, my fortune linking to his own, he'd find my door always open to receive him. And it struck me now that door he would pass, perhaps never more. Suddenly the air was clouded, all the furniture enshrouded with the smoke of vile tobacco. This was worse than all before. Smith, I cried, and in not offensive tones, it might have been expensive, for he knew the art of defensive, and could costermonger's floor. Recollect, it's after midnight. Are you going? Mind the floor. Quoth the vulture, nevermore. Smith, I cried, the gin was going down his throat in rivers flowing. If you want a bed, you know there's quite a nice hotel next door. Very cheap. I'm ill, and joking set apart, your hard smoking irritates my cough to choking. Having mentioned it before, really you should not compel one. Will you mizzle as before? Quoth the vulture, nevermore. Smith, I cried, that joke repeating merits little better treating for you than a condemnation as a nuisance and a bore. Drop it, pray. It isn't funny. I've to mix some rum and honey. If you want a little money, take some and be off next door. Run a bill up for me if you like, but do be off next door. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Smith, I shrieked, the accent humbler dropping, as another tumbler I beheld him mix. Be off, you drive me mad, it's striking 4. Leave the house and something in it. If you go on at the gin, it won't hold out another minute. Leave the house and shut the door. Take your beak from out my gin, and take your body through the door. Quoth the vulture, nevermore. And the vulture, never flitting, still is sitting, gulping down my stout by gallons, and my oysters by the score. And the beast, with no more breeding than a heathen savage feeding, the new carpet's tints unheeding, throws his shells upon the floor, and his smoke from out my curtains, and his stains from out my floor shall be sifted nevermore. Again, that is far and away the best parody of the Raven, in my opinion. That was written by Matthew Franklin Whittier, the real author of the actual poem, The Raven, about the experience that he had earlier written about as quails. Now, who that person was, I have no idea. It was somebody apparently that he knew back from his drinking days, and that was quite a while back. So it's somebody from an early acquaintance. I would almost wonder if it wasn't Albert Pike who plagiarized Abbey's poetry. You know, it's possible. But we'll never know, but it's conceivable. I felt, as I was reading, I thought, God, this is Albert Pike, but who knows? So I think that's all that I meant to share with you. There's absolutely no question whatsoever that I am correct that the vulture appeared in the carpetbag in December 1852, before it appeared in Crookshanks and before it appeared in Graham's magazine. That's historical record. Why are these illustrations in there that look like they were done by George Heim? I think it's because when Mathew was in Europe writing as quails in 1851, he not only visited the likes of Victor Hugo, but he made it a point to visit the offices of Punch and the offices of the other, Crookshanks. He met these people, and he probably showed them the carpetbag that he was writing in, and he probably negotiated for a couple jobs, and this was one of them. But this story, The Vulture, it was part of a series of stories that Mathew was writing anonymously, which contain inline illustrations like what was done in Punch and in Europe. And one of those has to do with the Bunker Hill Monument in Boston. And it makes it very clear that the writer lives in Boston because he can see the Boston Monument from where he lives. See? So this was done, if I'm correct about this being a series, this was written by a Boston resident, not by somebody in England. It's, so it's trying to trace these things down in a way that you can 100% prove it, especially against skeptics who tend to go into denial and refuse to admit things that are logically obvious, is an uphill battle. But definitely, I would say, I have Quails linking himself with Ethan Spike in Portland, writing as Ethan Spike. I have The Vulture, which is part of a series, arguably, which is, in fact, in the carpetbag before it ever shows up in either of the other two publications. So it's pretty definite. Now, the leap is to say that the person that wrote The Vulture had also written The Raven. But I've got lots of other evidence. That's coming out very soon. It'll be probably this summer in Real Paranormal Magazine, and I will go in great depth into this issue of Mathew as the real author of The Raven and how Edgar Allan Poe brazenly stole it from him. You'll notice that in this piece, the term sang-froid was used. Well, that's what Mathew, writing a travelogue as B, said about Edgar Allan Poe when he saw him recite The Raven in Boston. He mentioned that he had imperturbable sang-froid. So it all ties together. All of these little pieces tie together in this wonderful tapestry, which is why my books are so long. But my books are like this entry. I bring together all the pieces of evidence, and they all fit together. This is not like a conspiracy theory that breaks down if you look at it too close. This is a real case which gets deeper and deeper and deeper, and no matter where you look at this tapestry, you find the connections to everything else because it's real. That's what happens when you're dealing with something real, is that no matter where you look at it, you find that corroborating evidence. No matter how deeply you go, no matter where, you tie it in, it all fits. All right. So that's enough for this one. And I've got a lot of editing to do on this because I'm going to try to put those images in there, or at least most of them, if not all of them. So this will take me a while. I hope you found it of interest. I hope that somebody who knows about these subjects maybe is at least at least shook up enough to start taking me seriously in terms of my scholarship. I'm not a scholar by training. I'm a counselor by training, which I never used, never got a job in counseling. And I'm a very deep student of reincarnation. I'm an expert on that subject now. But as far as historical research, this is something I've learned to do over the last 11 years. I know the history of 19th century America through the lens of Matthew Franklin Whittier. Only those things that were connected to him do I know. I don't know the whole picture. So I'm hoping that scholars that do know that whole picture and come across this will realize that I've actually gotten hold of something real. So once again, thank you for watching.